Ever wonder why Jesus seemed to have a specific routine before each miracle? The answer, folks, is buried deep in the Ethiopian Bible, one of Christianity's oldest and most complete manuscripts, a treasure trove preserving traditions lost for centuries. While the Western versions of the Bible have been tweaked and edited over time, the Ethiopian tradition kept the original texts intact, and what they reveal are spiritual practices that were deliberately scrubbed or downplayed in later translations. This isn't just some academic curiosity, it's a game changer for how we understand Jesus' methods, laying bare a complex ritualistic system that paved the way for every single manifestation of divine power. For over 1,500 years, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has safeguarded a version of the Bible, packing 81 books, compared to the Protestant tradition's 66. Tucked away in those extra texts are detailed accounts of the spiritual prep Jesus undertook before healing the sick, multiplying loaves, or even raising the dead. These weren't just quick prayers. We're talking specific sequences of purification, deep concentration, and divine connection, all following patterns rooted in ancient Jewish tradition. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus often retreating to secluded spots before performing miracles. And it wasn't just for prayer. He'd engage in a series of preparations, including fasting, deep meditation, and the recitation of specific sacred names. Comparative studies confirm these practices were deeply embedded in first-century Jewish mystical traditions, especially a current known as Merkava mysticism, which focused on spiritual ascent through rigorous contemplative techniques. Our investigations show Jesus followed a consistent three-phase pattern for his ritual preparation. Phase 1 was about physical and spiritual cleansing, through ceremonial ablutions and specific fasting. Phase 2 involved entering a deep meditative state, where Jesus would connect with celestial forces by reciting sequences of divine names, preserved in early Kabbalistic tradition. The third phase, that's when he'd channel that concentrated spiritual energy to manifest the desired miracle. The Ethiopian tradition holds on to specific descriptions of these rituals, descriptions that were systematically cut from Western Bible versions during the early church councils. Later editors apparently deemed these practices too esoteric or maybe even too risky if misinterpreted by the average believer. So, the versions we've got today show Jesus performing miracles seemingly on the fly, completely glossing over all the spiritual groundwork that went into each divine manifestation. Ancient manuscript experts have unearthed entire passages in the Ethiopian Bible missing from Western editions, including detailed descriptions of what they called the preparation of the divine vessel. These sections explain how Jesus transformed his consciousness and physical body into a fitting conduit for the manifestation of spiritual power. The process involved specific breathing techniques, ritualistic body posturing, and the cultivation of an altered state of consciousness, allowing for direct connection with celestial forces. The most astonishing discovery in these Ethiopian texts is the description of a system linking different types of miracles to specific preparatory rituals. For physical healings, Jesus would perform rites involving the laying on of hands in precise sequences over specific energy points on his own body, following exact maps preserved in esoteric Jewish tradition. For miracles involving natural elements, like turning water into wine or multiplying loaves, the rituals included specific invocations directed at angels, responsible for various aspects of material creation. The historical context for these rituals traces back to the practices of the temple in Jerusalem, where priests followed strict protocols of purification and preparation before any sacred ceremony. Jesus, having been educated in Jewish tradition, naturally incorporated and expanded these practices, adapting them for his specific needs as a channel for divine will. The Ethiopian tradition suggests Jesus not only knew these techniques but had perfected them over years of study with spiritual masters whose names are preserved only in the oldest manuscripts. Historical sources indicate these ritualistic practices weren't exclusive to Jesus. They were part of a broader tradition among first-century Jewish mystics who aimed to manifest spiritual powers through precise methods of preparation and concentration. What set Jesus apart was his extraordinary ability to consistently and powerfully channel these energies, transforming techniques others used for personal experiences into tools to serve and heal humanity. The systematic removal of these ritual descriptions from later Bible versions reflects a fundamental shift in early Christian theology. The early church fathers chose to emphasize the spontaneous divine nature of Jesus' miracles, minimizing or outright eliminating references to the specific methods he employed. This editorial decision had profound consequences for the development of Christian spirituality, creating a chasm between active spiritual practice and the passive faith that has characterized much of Western Christianity. If you're just now unearthing these groundbreaking insights into Jesus' hidden practices, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These ancient teachings have been guarded for centuries in specific traditions, and it's crucial we keep digging into these mysteries together, transforming our understanding of spirituality. Your participation in this journey of discovery is essential if we're going to keep bringing these lost teachings to light, teachings that could revolutionize your personal spiritual practice. The Ethiopian texts reveal Jesus often spent entire nights in ritual preparation before the most significant miracles. The account of Lazarus' resurrection, for instance, details 3 days of intensive fasting and spiritual prep leading up to the event. During that time, Jesus reportedly performed progressive purification rituals, culminating in a specific ceremony involving the recitation of angelic names and the creation of a spiritual protection circle around the tomb. The tradition preserved in Ethiopia also documents Jesus' use of specific ritual objects he carried: sacred stones, consecrated oils, and special fabrics blessed through particular ceremonies. These weren't superstitious amulets. They were spiritual tools aiding in the concentration and channeling of divine energy. Each item played a specific role in the ritualistic system Jesus developed throughout his years of ministry. The question of how these teachings got twisted and transformed over the centuries unveils a complex process of institutional adaptation and censorship that profoundly shaped modern Christianity. Ancient manuscript specialists have uncovered evidence of at least 7 distinct waves of editorial revision that impacted early Christian texts, each one stripping away specific layers of information about Jesus' ritual practices. The first major transformation hit during the immediate apostolic period, as the early disciples grappled with the need to make Jesus' teachings accessible to non-Jewish audiences who lacked prior knowledge of Hebrew mystical traditions. This initial adaptation was relatively conservative, keeping the essence of the practices while simplifying their presentation. Yet, recent investigations suggest that even in this early phase, elements deemed too esoteric were gradually minimized in the oral accounts that later became the canonical Gospels. The second major transformation coincided with Christianity's expansion into the Roman world. When early church authorities realized certain ritual practices could be mistaken for pagan or Greco-Roman mystical traditions, creating credibility and acceptance issues among new converts. The most significant distortion process, according to sources preserved in Ethiopian monastic libraries, happened during the church councils of the 3rd and 4th centuries. That's when the institutionalization of Christianity demanded doctrinal standardization, leaving little room for complex individual practices. Church leaders of this era actively pushed an interpretation of Jesus' work that highlighted his exceptional divine nature, implying his methods were inaccessible to ordinary humans and, therefore, shouldn't be attempted or even discussed in detail. During this crucial period, entire manuscripts were rewritten, scrubbing specific descriptions of Jesus' preparatory rituals and replacing them with vague language about prayer and meditation. Comparative studies between ancient versions preserved in Ethiopia and later texts exposed dramatic differences in the quantity and specificity of ritual information. Where Ethiopian texts detail precise sequences of spiritual preparation, later versions often contain only brief, generic references to Jesus spending time in prayer. The deepest distortion involved reinterpreting the very nature of miracles, transforming them from events resulting from learnable spiritual techniques into spontaneous manifestations of inaccessible divine power. This fundamental shift didn't just alter the theological understanding of miracles, it virtually wiped out any incentive for Christians to develop their own spiritual capacities through systematic methods. The outcome was an increasingly passive spirituality, where believers were encouraged to wait for divine intervention instead of actively participating in their own spiritual development. Archaeological and documentary evidence unearthed in recent decades reveals this transformation wasn't some natural process of doctrinal evolution. No, it was the direct result of conscious political decisions made by ecclesiastical leaders aiming to consolidate institutional power. Preserved correspondences between 4th century bishops show explicit discussions about the necessity of discouraging independent ritual practices among the faithful, arguing that such activities could lead to the fragmentation of church authority and the rise of heretical movements. The discovery of these ancient administrative documents offers a fascinating window into the political process behind spiritual censorship. The ecclesiastical authorities of the time didn't deny the efficacy of the ritual practices described in the oldest texts. Instead, they argued that their widespread dissemination would be dangerous for church unity. This concern for institutional control trumped considerations about the spiritual value of these practices for individuals, resulting in their systematic suppression. Modern investigations into the preservation of these teachings in marginal traditions reveal that not all information was lost during this process of institutional censorship. Isolated Christian communities, particularly in Ethiopia, Armenia, and certain remote regions of the Middle East, managed to preserve more complete versions of the original texts, keeping alive spiritual practice traditions that trace directly back to the methods used by Jesus and his immediate disciples. These discoveries raise profound questions about the nature of spiritual authority and the role of religious institutions in preserving versus modifying original teachings. What would be the state of modern Christian spirituality if these ritual methods had been preserved and openly taught throughout the centuries? How would our understanding of spiritual practice change if we had direct access to the specific techniques Jesus used to prepare for manifestations of spiritual power? These aren't just academic questions. They strike at the heart of contemporary issues concerning personal development, spiritual authority, and the relationship between tradition and innovation in religious practices. What clearly emerges from the analysis of these historical processes is that the censorship of Jesus' ritual methods wasn't driven by concerns about their validity or spiritual safety. No, it was fueled by political anxieties over institutional control and doctrinal uniformity. This realization has significant implications for how we understand both the history of Christianity and the possibilities for contemporary spiritual practice. The systematic transformations of the original teachings didn't stop at simply removing ritual methods. They evolved into a complete restructuring of how divinity was understood to operate in the physical world. Documents preserved in Ethiopian monasteries reveal that early Christian communities held a far more integrated view, connecting ritual preparation, mental states, and the manifestation of phenomena we'd now label as supernatural. This integration wasn't seen as magic or superstition, but as the natural functioning of spiritual laws governing the interaction between human consciousness and material reality. Investigations by historians specializing in early Christianity demonstrate that Jesus didn't perform miracles as isolated, spontaneous events. Instead, he followed specific preparatory protocols involving physical purification, structured fasting, deep meditation, and energetic harmonization rituals. These protocols were systematically taught to his closest disciples, who in turn passed them on to select communities of advanced practitioners. The Ethiopian tradition has preserved detailed descriptions of these methods, including the precise sequence of actions Jesus performed before each type of spiritual manifestation. For instance, before physical healings, Jesus followed a 3-day ritual that included partial fasting, prayers at specific times aligned with solar and lunar cycles, and a final hand consecration ceremony performed in the presence of at least 2 disciples who served as witnesses and energetic amplifiers. Before multiplying food, the protocol was different, involving meditation on divine abundance, specific visualizations for the transformation of matter, and the creation of a group energetic field through the coordinated participation of the disciples present. These details, completely absent from modern canonical texts, offer a radically different perspective on the nature of miracles and their reproducibility. The Ethiopian Bible contains entire passages dedicated to describing these ritual protocols, treating them not as historical curiosities, but as practical instructions for contemporary practitioners. A particularly revealing passage describes how Jesus prepared his disciples to actively participate in healing processes, teaching them specific breathing techniques, hand positioning, and mental focusing that significantly amplified therapeutic results. These teachings suggest that miracles weren't exclusive manifestations of Jesus' divinity, but rather demonstrations of universal spiritual principles that could be learned and applied by other adequately prepared individuals. Comparative studies between Ethiopian texts and fragments discovered in other Eastern Christian traditions reveal remarkable consistency in these ritual descriptions, suggesting they aren't later inventions, but authentic preservation of very ancient traditions. 6th century Armenian manuscripts contain similar references to Jesus' preparatory rituals, albeit in more fragmented form due to the persecution these communities faced. Coptic texts unearthed in the 20th century also include allusions to these methods, confirming that knowledge of these protocols was widely distributed among early Christian communities before their systematic suppression. Linguistic analysis of these texts unveils specific technical terminology for different types of ritual preparation, pointing to a sophisticated system of spiritual categorization that was completely lost to Western tradition. Terms like adamantine purification, celestial alignment, and opening the inner portals appear consistently across different sources, suggesting a standardized vocabulary to describe specific states of consciousness and energetic practices. This technical terminology indicates that early Christians possessed detailed knowledge about altered states of consciousness, subtle energy manipulation, and techniques to potentiate latent human capacities. Archaeological evidence uncovered at ancient Christian sites in Ethiopia includes ceremonial artifacts that directly correspond to the textual descriptions of these rituals. Special chalices for consecrated water, crystals used in healing processes, specific incenses for different types of spiritual work, and even stone-carved diagrams representing body posturing for advanced meditation have been found in archaeological contexts dating back to the first centuries of Christianity. These physical findings validate the textual descriptions and demonstrate that the described rituals weren't merely theoretical, but were concretely practiced by historical Christian communities. The suppression of this ritual knowledge had profound consequences that stretch far beyond the simple loss of spiritual techniques. It represented a fundamental shift in Christian understanding of human nature, the individual potential for spiritual development, and the relationship between personal practice and divine experience. By removing the specific methods through which Jesus prepared for spiritual manifestations, ecclesiastical authorities created an artificial separation between the divine and the human that didn't exist in the original teachings. This artificial separation had the effect of discouraging individual exploration of latent spiritual capacities, promoting instead an institutional dependency for access to the sacred. The faithful were taught to seek clerical intercession rather than develop their own capacities for direct connection with the divine. This shift not only impoverished the individual spiritual experience but also concentrated spiritual power in the hands of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that could control access to sacred experiences. Modern investigations into communities that have preserved elements of these ritual teachings reveal extraordinary results in terms of physical well-being, mental clarity, and developed intuitive capacities. Contemporary practitioners who have reconstituted aspects of the protocols described in the Ethiopian Bible report experiences of healing, amplified intuition, and states of consciousness that closely correspond to the descriptions found in the ancient texts. While it's important to approach these accounts with appropriate scientific skepticism, the consistency of the results across different practitioners suggests there's more to this than meets the eye. The practices and cultural contexts suggest that the methods preserved within these traditions may contain valuable insights into human potential for spiritual development. The rediscovery of these ritualistic teachings raises significant questions regarding the future of Christian spiritual practice and its capacity to integrate ancestral wisdom with contemporary understandings of consciousness, neuroscience, and quantum physics. Is it truly possible to recover and scientifically validate the methods Jesus employed to prepare himself for spiritual manifestations? How might such an integration transform our comprehension of religion, science, and human potential? These inquiries are not merely academic. They represent opportunities for the evolution of both spirituality and scientific knowledge concerning the nature of consciousness and its interaction with physical reality. The impact of suppressing these ritualistic understandings on the historical development of Christianity was monumentally transformative, forging a fundamental gap between Jesus' original practices and the traditions that subsequently evolved. When we examine the historical evidence regarding how these changes transpired, we uncover a gradual yet deliberate process of systematically eliminating the more specific ritual elements from early Christian teachings. Historical documents preserved in Coptic and Syriac monasteries reveal that even into the 4th century, isolated Christian communities still maintained ritual traditions that included specific preparations for spiritual work, energy purification techniques, and methods for expanding consciousness. all of which were considered an integral part of authentic Christian practice. The fundamental transformation occurred as Christianity began its institutionalization throughout the Roman Empire, a process that inherently necessitated the standardization of practices and the elimination of elements deemed problematic for political and religious unification. The specific rituals Jesus employed posed an obstacle to this standardization because they demanded specialized knowledge, extensive individual preparation, and a sophisticated understanding of states of consciousness that could not be readily transmitted through conventional hierarchical structures. Ecclesiastical authorities of the era made the strategic decision to simplify the teachings, focusing on doctrinal aspects communicable via sermons and standardized catechism, while gradually discouraging or outright prohibiting ritual practices requiring intensive individual preparation. This decision bore consequences extending far beyond the mere loss of specific techniques. It represented a paradigmatic shift in Christian understanding regarding the nature of spiritual development and the individual's role in their own spiritual growth journey. Within the original teachings preserved in the Ethiopic Bible, spiritual development was understood as an active process, demanding conscious participation, disciplined preparation, and the application of specific techniques to expand an individual's capacity to attune to elevated spiritual frequencies. Jesus was presented not merely as an example to be admired, but as a model whose methods could be studied, comprehended, and applied by other sincere seekers, willing to invest the requisite time and effort to master the practices involved. The elimination of these practical teachings created a fundamental void, subsequently filled by a theology emphasizing external dependence over internal development, passive faith instead of active practice, and institutional worship as a substitute for direct experience of the sacred. Adherents were gradually discouraged from pursuing individual spiritual development through specific practices, being taught instead to place their trust exclusively in clerical intercession and the sacraments administered by the ecclesiastical hierarchy. This shift not only impoverished the individual spiritual experience, but also established a system of control that concentrated spiritual power in the hands of a clerical class, which could then dictate who had legitimate access to the sacred and under what conditions such access would be granted. Contemporary investigations into the effects of this suppression reveal that the loss of specific ritualistic teachings profoundly impacted not only religious practice, but also the development of Western understanding concerning consciousness, human potential, and the relationship between mind and reality. Eastern traditions that preserved similar knowledge about expanded states of consciousness and spiritual development techniques demonstrate human capacities that appear extraordinary when compared to conventional Western standards, yet were considered natural and expected developments in the context where these practices were maintained. A comparison between traditions that retained practical teachings on spiritual development and those that lost them uncovers significant differences in terms of developed capacities, holistic well-being, and comprehension of the nature of reality. Modern studies on neuroplasticity and expanded states of consciousness are beginning to provide scientific validation for many of the principles underlying the rituals described in the Ethiopic Bible, suggesting that the techniques preserved in these traditions may possess solid neurological foundations that were intuitively understood by ancient practitioners. Research into meditation, altered states of consciousness, and specific breathing techniques demonstrates that practices akin to those detailed in the Ethiopic texts can produce measurable changes in brain activity, nervous system function, and the capacity to process information in ways that transcend conventional patterns. This convergence between ancient wisdom and contemporary scientific discoveries suggests that the rituals employed by Jesus may have been based on a sophisticated empirical understanding of human consciousness and its ability to interact with subtle aspects of reality. The rediscovery and scientific validation of these insights represent an extraordinary opportunity to integrate ancestral wisdom with contemporary understanding of human potential. When we examine the ritual descriptions preserved in the Ethiopic Bible through the lens of modern neuroscience, quantum physics, and transpersonal psychology, fascinating correlations emerge, suggesting that the methods Jesus utilized may have been based on valid scientific principles simply not understood in modern terms by the original practitioners. This potential for integration between ancestral spiritual knowledge and contemporary scientific discoveries opens entirely new horizons for comprehending the nature of reality, human potential, and the possibilities for individual and collective development that transcend the limitations imposed by purely materialistic or purely spiritual paradigms. A detailed analysis of the rituals outlined in the Ethiopic Bible reveals that Jesus adhered to specific preparatory protocols encompassing not only spiritual elements, but also practices we now recognize as having direct impacts on human physiology and nervous system function. Contemporary studies on altered states of consciousness indicate that certain combinations of controlled breathing, structured fasting, and specific bodily postures can produce measurable changes in brainwave patterns, neurotransmitter production, and the activation of brain regions associated with expanded perception and enhanced cognitive abilities. The Ethiopic texts preserve detailed descriptions of ritual sequences that include periods of isolation in specific locations, breathing practices following precise mathematical patterns, and bodily postures that remarkably correspond to techniques independently developed in Eastern traditions for activating subtle energetic centers within the human body. Modern investigations into the relationship between body posture, respiratory patterns, and states of consciousness confirm that the positions described in Jesus' rituals may have direct effects on cerebral blood flow, oxygenation of neural tissues, and the activation of neurological systems linked to intuition, creativity, and unconventional information processing. The most striking discovery in contemporary analyses of these texts is that the rituals appear to have been designed to foster specific states of coherence among different physiological systems of the human body, including synchronization between heart rhythms, respiratory patterns, and brain activity, phenomena that recent research associates with optimal states of human functioning and expanded capacities for perception and action. Neuroscientists who have studied the ritual descriptions preserved in the Ethiopic tradition have identified impressive correlations between the described techniques and modern methods for inducing psychophysiological coherence, which facilitates access to latent human capacities that typically remain dormant or underdeveloped. This coherence among various bodily systems seems to create ideal conditions for individual consciousness to become more receptive to subtle information and energies existing beyond the confines of common sensory perception, thereby enabling forms of knowledge and action that transcend the usual limitations of ordinary human experience. The described rituals also encompass elements we now recognize as advanced techniques for visualization and attention direction, which neuroplasticity research demonstrates are capable of producing measurable structural changes in the brain, including increased neural density in regions associated with concentration, empathy, and complex information processing. The visualization sequences preserved in the Ethiopic texts follow progressions corresponding to natural neural development processes, suggesting that the originators of these rituals possessed a profound intuitive understanding of how the human mind learns, integrates information, and develops new capacities through structured and progressive training. This understanding manifests in detailed instructions for mental exercises that gradually expand the ability to sustain focused attention, visualize complex scenarios with increasing clarity, and cultivate sensitivity to perceive information that typically remains below the threshold of common consciousness. Another extraordinary aspect of the rituals preserved in the Ethiopic Bible is their integration of elements we would today categorize as belonging to diverse scientific disciplines, including principles related to physics, biology, psychology, and even emerging discoveries in fields such as bioenergy and non-local communication. The texts describe practices involving conscious interaction with subtle energetic fields surrounding the human body, techniques to synchronize one's biological rhythms with broader natural cycles, and methods to establish deep empathic connection with others that transcends conventional verbal and nonverbal communication mechanisms. Contemporary research on human bioelectrical fields, circadian synchronization, and unconscious nonverbal communication phenomena provides plausible scientific bases for many of these ritual elements previously dismissed as purely symbolic or fantastical. The technical depth of the ritual instructions suggests that Jesus had access to an extraordinarily sophisticated training system, one developed and refined over generations of experienced practitioners. The texts preserve not only the basic techniques, but also advanced variations applied in specific circumstances, safety protocols to prevent adverse effects during intensive practices, and methods for evaluating progress and adjusting practices as needed for each individual. This systematic and comprehensive structure indicates that the rituals were not isolated or improvised practices, but components of a human development tradition tested and perfected through extensive practical application over time. Particularly fascinating is that the rituals include elements seemingly designed to facilitate not just individual development, but also the capacity to positively influence others and situations through mechanisms transcending direct physical action. The texts describe techniques for projecting benevolent intention in ways that can be perceived and benefit distant individuals, methods for harmonizing disruptive energies within groups or environments, and practices for channeling healing influences that operate through principles. Contemporary research on non-local effects of consciousness and distant healing are beginning to investigate via rigorous scientific protocols. While these aspects of the rituals remain controversial even within scientific communities open to exploring unconventional phenomena, preliminary evidence from controlled studies suggests that specific forms of focused intention may exert measurable effects on biological systems, even when applied remotely. The preservation of these ritualistic teachings within the Ethiopic tradition represents an invaluable treasure, not merely for historical understanding of Jesus' practices, but also as a resource for contemporary exploration into human potential and the development of capacities that may prove crucial for addressing the complex challenges humanity currently faces. The integration of ancestral wisdom with modern scientific methodologies offers extraordinary possibilities for developing holistic approaches to education, health, conflict resolution, and the creation of more harmonious communities that honor both the material and spiritual dimensions of human existence. This synthesis between ancient knowledge and contemporary discoveries can pave the way for forms of individual and social development that transcend the limitations of purely scientific or purely spiritual paradigms, offering integrated perspectives that acknowledge the multidimensional complexity of human experience and the potential for positive growth and transformation. The revelation of these hidden rituals unveils an even more astonishing reality when we analyze how these practices were systematically expunged from Western historical records. Recent academic investigations demonstrate that during the early centuries of Christianity, specific factions within the primitive church made deliberate decisions to eliminate any mention of Jesus's ritualistic preparations from the documents that would eventually form the official biblical canon. Studies of ancient manuscripts reveal evidence of intentional redactions where entire passages were removed or altered to omit references to the preparatory practices Jesus undertook prior to his most extraordinary acts. This suppression was not accidental. Rather, it represented a calculated strategy to present miracles as spontaneous manifestations of divinity, rather than as the outcomes of specific techniques that could be learned and practiced by other dedicated individuals. The motivations behind this historical censorship become evident when we examine the political and social implications of preserving knowledge about the actual methodologies Jesus employed. Had people understood that miracles were the result of specific practices accessible to anyone with sufficient dedication, it would have fundamentally altered the structure of religious authority being established by the leaders of the early church. The maintenance of mystery and supernatural exclusivity was crucial for justifying ecclesiastical hierarchies and institutional control over access to the divine. Historical documents preserved in Ethiopic archives suggest intense debates during the early church councils regarding how much practical information ought to be retained in official texts, with conservative factions arguing that revealing Jesus's specific techniques would be perilous to social stability and clerical authority. The Ethiopic tradition maintained these teachings precisely because it remained relatively isolated from the political pressures that shaped European Christianity during critical centuries of doctrinal formation. While other Christian communities were compelled to conform to standardized interpretations imposed by imperial and ecclesiastical authorities, the mountains of Ethiopia offered natural protection that allowed for the preservation of older, more complete traditions. Specialists in ecclesiastical history observe that this preservation was facilitated by the unique system of knowledge transmission characteristic of Ethiopic monastic communities, where specialized teachings were passed down through direct lineages from masters to selected disciples, ensuring that sensitive information was kept within circles of experienced and trustworthy practitioners. The depth of the preserved rituals suggests that Jesus had access to human development traditions that were extraordinarily sophisticated, even by contemporary standards of understanding human potential and altered states of consciousness. The techniques encompass physical preparation methods involving specific bodily postures, elaborate breathing patterns, and movement sequences that appear to have been developed to optimize neurological function and concentration capacity. Modern research on neuroplasticity and advanced meditative states confirms that many of the practices detailed in the Ethiopic texts have measurable effects on brain activity, producing states of consciousness characterized by increased neural coherence, reduced activity in the default mode network associated with self-centered thought, and activation of brain regions linked to empathy, intuition, and holistic information processing. Particularly intriguing is that the rituals incorporate components seemingly developed to facilitate what the texts describe as harmonization with broader natural and cosmic forces. These practices involve synchronization with solar and lunar cycles, alignment with terrestrial magnetic fields, and techniques for perceiving and working with subtle energies, all of which contemporary research on biofields and geomagnetic effects on human biology is beginning to investigate through rigorous scientific protocols. While some aspects of these teachings remain controversial within the mainstream scientific community, preliminary evidence suggests that subtle environmental factors can exert significant influences on physiological function and states of consciousness, thereby validating aspects of ancient practices previously dismissed as superstition. The rituals also incorporate communal and relational elements that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and interpersonal influence. The texts describe techniques for creating fields of emotional coherence within groups, methods for facilitating empathic communication that transcends verbal limitations, and practices for coordinating collective intentions in ways that amplify capacity, the capacity of an individual to influence complex situations. Contemporary studies on physiological synchronization in groups, emotional contagion, and the effects of collective meditation provide scientific evidence supporting many observations preserved within Ethiopian teachings. These insights highlight how trained individuals can facilitate positive transformations in communities through the skillful application of specific relational principles. Which aspects of these ancient rituals do you think might be most relevant for personal development in today's world? A careful analysis of the specific protocols reveals that Jesus didn't just practice individual techniques. He operated within an integrated system that combined physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual preparation in ways that maximized his capacity to access and channel extraordinary states of consciousness. This holistic approach included periods of solitude for developing deep concentration, practices of service to cultivate genuine compassion, intensive study of sacred texts to expand conceptual understanding, and training in specific techniques to modulate autonomic nervous system function and access states of optimized psychophysiological coherence. The systematic structure of these teachings suggests that Jesus was trained within a tradition that had developed precise methodologies to facilitate accelerated human development and access to latent capacities that typically lie dormant in most people. The protocols included diagnostics to assess individual readiness, gradual progressions that respected the natural limitations of the nervous system, safety measures to prevent adverse effects during intensive practices, and integration methods to incorporate insights and capacities developed during altered states of consciousness into daily life in balanced and sustainable ways. This technical sophistication indicates that the practices were not improvised experiments, but rather represented the culmination of generations of development and refinement through extensive practical application. The Ethiopian documents preserve not only the basic techniques but also advanced variations applied in specific circumstances, adaptations for different personality types and individual constitutions, and specialized protocols for situations requiring particularly powerful or delicate interventions. This flexibility and precision demonstrate that Jesus operated within a knowledge system that was simultaneously rigorously structured and creatively adaptable, allowing for effective application across a wide variety of contexts and needs. The preservation of these technical details within the Ethiopian tradition represents an invaluable resource for contemporary understanding of human potential development and the possibilities for integrating ancestral wisdom with modern scientific methodologies. The systematic suppression of these teachings by established powers throughout history reveals consistent patterns of how knowledge that could democratize access to extraordinary human capacities has been repeatedly censored or distorted, to maintain structures of social control and institutional authority. Historical analyses demonstrate that whenever traditions of personal development offered ordinary individuals possibilities to access states of consciousness and capacities that challenged official narratives about human nature and the need for institutional intermediaries, these traditions faced persecution, forced absorption into controlled systems, or elimination through the destruction of documents and the dispersion of practicing communities. The case of Jesus' rituals represents just one example of a much broader pattern where practical knowledge about human development was systematically removed from public circulation and preserved only in esoteric traditions or isolated communities that managed to resist homogenizing pressures. Investigations into other spiritual traditions reveal similar evidence of specific technical teachings that were gradually replaced by more vague and symbolic interpretations that maintained an appearance of profundity without providing sufficient practical information for the independent replication of the extraordinary capacities demonstrated by the original founders. This strategy of obfuscation has been particularly effective because it allows institutions to maintain control over official narratives while simultaneously preserving an appearance of respect for spiritual traditions. By transforming practical teachings into abstract doctrines and specific practices into purely symbolic rituals, authorities managed to neutralize the transformative potential of authentic traditions without provoking direct resistance from communities that value their spiritual heritage. The result has been the perpetuation of systems where access to knowledge about human development remains limited to specialized circles, while the general population receives only diluted versions that offer psychological comfort without empowering genuine transformation. The rediscovery and revitalization of these teachings in contemporary times offer extraordinary opportunities for individual and social development that transcend limitations imposed by paradigms that artificially separate the scientific and spiritual dimensions of human experience. The careful integration of wisdom preserved in ancient traditions with rigorous modern scientific research methodologies can facilitate the development of holistic approaches to education, healthcare, conflict resolution, and the creation of communities that honor the multidimensional complexity of human potential. This synthesis represents not only the possibility of recovering capacities that have been systematically suppressed, but also an opportunity to develop individual and collective ways of life that are simultaneously deeply rooted in ancestral wisdom and creatively adapted to confront the unique challenges of the contemporary world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.